The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble steps of the Riverside Concert Hall as Margaret Chun stood at the bottom, looking up at the impressive building that had intimidated her for weeks. She clutched her old leather music folder. Tighter, the same one she had carried since her teenage years when dreams of becoming a concert pianist seemed possible. That was before life took a different turn, before bills needed paying and responsibilities piled up like autumn leaves. At 42, Margaret had learned to find contentment in small moments. The way her fingers still remembered complex melodies, even after 12-hour shifts at the hospital. The peaceful expression on patients' faces when she played softly in the empty corridors during her breaks. The way music could transform even the sterile, antiseptic-scented hallways into something magical. But standing here now, watching elegantly dressed musicians flowing through the entrance like water, Margaret felt every bit of her ordinary appearance. Her navy cardigan had been washed so many times it had lost its original shape. Her comfortable black shoes were practical rather than fashionable. Her graying hair was pulled back in the same simple bun she wore every day to work. She looked exactly like what she was, a hospital janitor who had been cleaning floors and emptying trash cans for 15 years. The irony wasn't lost on her. Just yesterday, she had been mopping these very floors as part of her weekend cleaning job at the concert hall. She knew every corner of this building, every spot where dust liked to gather, every door that squeaked when opened. The security guard, Robert, had waved at her through the glass doors just minutes ago, probably wondering why she was entering through the front entrance instead of the service door. Margaret had almost chickened out 3 times on the bus ride. Here, each time she thought about the other contestants, young conservatory graduates with perfect technique and designer performance dresses, she felt more out of place. What was a middle-aged cleaning lady doing competing against people who had dedicated their entire lives to music? The answer came to her the same way it had 3 weeks ago when she first saw the audition notice pinned to the community board at the hospital. It was written in her mother's voice, the same woman who had scraped together money for piano lessons when Margaret was 8 years old. Music doesn't care about your clothes or your job title, sweetheart. It only cares about what's in your heart. Her mother had been gone for 5 years now, but Margaret could still hear her say those words whenever doubt crept in. She had been the one person who truly understood Margaret's gift, who would sit for hours listening to her practice on their old, upright piano that was missing 2 keys and badly needed tuning. Margaret took a deep breath and stepped through the heavy glass doors. The lobby was buzzing with activity. Young pianists sat in clusters, some nervously running through finger exercises in the air, others discussing their repertoire choices with animated gestures. The sound of distant piano music drifted from the practice rooms upstairs, complex passages being repeated over and over until they reached perfection. She made her way to the registration table, where a polished young woman in a crisp white blouse was checking names off a list. The woman's hair was styled in perfect waves, and her makeup looked like it had been applied by a professional. Everything about her screamed competence and belonging. "Excuse me," Margaret said softly, approaching the table. The young woman looked up, her smile faltering slightly as she took in Margaret's appearance. Her eyes did a quick scan from head to toe, the kind of assessment that happens in milliseconds but feels like an eternity. "Are you here for the cleaning service?" she asked, her tone polite but dismissive. "I think the maintenance crew uses the side entrance." Heat crept up Margaret's neck, but she kept her voice steady. "Actually, I'm here for the piano audition. My name is Margaret Chun." The woman's eyebrows shot up so high they nearly disappeared under her perfect bangs. She looked down at her list, then back up at Margaret, as if trying to reconcile what she was seeing with what was written on the paper. "Oh," she said, the single word carrying volumes of surprise and barely concealed skepticism. "Well, you'll need to fill out these forms." She handed over a clipboard with obvious reluctance. As if Margaret might somehow contaminate the pristine paperwork, Margaret took the forms and found a seat in the corner of the lobby, as far from the other contestants as possible. She could feel eyes on her, hear the whispers that people thought were quiet, but really weren't. The conversations around her were filled with names she recognized from her late-night internet searches, famous piano teachers, prestigious competitions, summer programs that cost more than she made in 6 months. One young man with perfectly styled hair was discussing his recent performance at Carnegie Hall. A woman in an elegant burgundy dress mentioned her upcoming recording contract. Another talked about studying in Vienna with some world-renowned professor whose name Margaret couldn't quite catch. She filled out the form slowly, her handwriting careful and neat. Under musical education, she paused. What was she supposed to write? Self-taught seemed inadequate. Learn from YouTube videos and library books sounded pathetic. In the end, she simply wrote private study. The practice rooms upstairs were another world entirely. Margaret could hear snippets of Rachmaninoff, Chopin, and Liszt floating down the hallway. The technical skill was undeniable. These musicians could play passages that would make most people's fingers cramp just from watching. But as she listened, Margaret noticed something else. The music was perfect, but it felt somehow empty. Like beautiful words spoken without meaning. She thought about the piece she had chosen, Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor. It wasn't the most technically challenging piece she knew, but it was the one that spoke to her soul. She had discovered it during one of her loneliest periods, right after her divorce when she was working double shifts just to make ends meet. The music had somehow captured everything she was feeling, the sadness, the hope, the quiet strength that keeps you going when everything else falls apart. Margaret had spent countless hours with that piece, not just learning the notes, but understanding the story it told. She played it during her breaks at the hospital, in the quiet moments between patients' needs. She had watched how the melody could calm an anxious visitor or bring a smile to a tired doctor's face. The music had become part of her, woven into the fabric of her daily life in a way that had nothing to do with competition or recognition. A young woman in a stunning black gown walked past Margaret's corner, her heels clicking confidently on the marble floor. She glanced at Margaret with curious eyes, then leaned over to whisper something to her companion. They both looked back, and Margaret caught the tail end of their conversation. Community center recital or something. Should someone tell her double quotes going to be painful to watch. Margaret felt the familiar sting of being underestimated, but it was nothing new. She had been underestimated her entire life, by teachers who thought she wasn't smart enough for advanced classes, by employers who assumed she couldn't handle responsibility, by people who made judgments based on appearances rather than character. But she had also learned something valuable over the years. The people who underestimated her were usually the ones who ended up being surprised. Not because she was trying to prove them wrong, but because she had learned to prove herself right. She closed her eyes and let the sounds of the bustling lobby fade away. In her mind, she could hear the opening notes of the ballade, feel the way her fingers would shape each phrase. This wasn't about showing off or competing with anyone else. This was about sharing something beautiful, something that had sustained her through the hardest years of her life. When she opened her eyes, Margaret felt calmer. Let them whisper. Let them assume. In a few hours, when her name was called, she would walk onto that stage and do what she had been doing quietly for years. Turn ordinary moments into something extraordinary through the power of music. The morning sun had shifted, and now it was streaming through the tall windows, casting everything in a golden glow. Margaret smiled to herself, remembering something her mother used to say. The stage doesn't care who you are when you walk onto it. It only cares who you become when you sit down to play. The waiting area had filled up considerably since Margaret first arrived. Elegant musicians dotted the space like flowers in a perfectly manicured garden, each one more polished than the last. Margaret remained in her corner seat, watching the social dynamics unfold with the quiet observation skills she had developed over years of working in busy hospitals. 3 young women had claimed the center seating area, their designer gowns spread carefully around them to avoid wrinkles. One wore a stunning emerald dress that probably cost more than Margaret's monthly rent. Another sported a sleek black number with intricate beadwork that caught the light every time she moved. The third had chosen deep burgundy silk that made her look like she had stepped out of a fashion magazine. Their conversation carried across the lobby in the way that confident voices do, not quite loud enough to be considered rude, but certainly audible to anyone nearby. They spoke in the casual manner of people who had grown up in this world, dropping names of famous conductors and prestigious music festivals like they were discussing the weather. "Did you hear that Vincent is judging today?" The one in emerald sighed, adjusting her perfectly styled hair. "I studied with his former student at Juilliard. I'm hoping he'll remember me from the master class last summer." "Oh, you're so lucky," Burgundy Dress replied. "I only got to work with him briefly during the international competition in Prague. But his technique recommendations completely transformed my Rachmaninoff." Margaret knew they were talking about Dr. Vincent Harrison, one of the most respected piano professors in the country. She had watched dozens of his masterclasses online during her lunch breaks, studying the way he talked about musical interpretation and emotional connection. She wondered if any of these young women had actually absorbed those lessons, or if they were just collecting famous names like trophies. A tall young man with an expensive-looking suit joined their circle. His shoes alone probably cost more than Margaret made in a week. He set down a leather portfolio that looked like it had never seen a day of actual use, everything about him screaming privilege and opportunity. "I just finished warming up in practice room 7, he announced, his voice carrying the confidence of someone who had never been told he didn't belong somewhere. "The acoustics in there are incredible. Though I have to say, some of the people here today are ... interesting choices." His eyes swept the room and landed on Margaret for just a moment before moving on. That single glance contained everything she had grown used to over the years: the quick assessment, the dismissal, the assumption that she was somehow in the wrong place. "I know exactly what you mean," Emerald Dress said, lowering her voice, just enough to seem conspiratorial while still being perfectly audible. "I saw someone earlier who looked like she wandered in from the street. I actually thought she might be lost." Margaret felt her cheeks warm, but she kept her expression neutral. She had learned long ago that reacting to these comments only gave them more power. Instead, she focused on the music drifting down from the practice rooms above, where other contestants were running through their final preparations. The sound of a Chopin etude floated through the air, technically perfect, but somehow mechanical. Each note was precisely placed, every run perfectly executed, but it felt like listening to a very sophisticated computer program, rather than a human being expressing something meaningful. Margaret wondered if the pianist felt anything while playing, or if it was all muscle memory and mathematical precision. Another contestant, a woman who looked to be in her early 30s, approached the registration table with a question about practice room availability. Margaret noticed that the receptionist's entire demeanor changed when addressing her. The smile was genuine, the voice warm and helpful, the body language open and welcoming. It was like watching someone flip a switch. "Of course, let me check the schedule for you," the receptionist said, her fingers dancing across her tablet. "We have room 12 available for the next 30 minutes. Will that work for you?" "That would be perfect, thank you so much," contestant replied, her own voice carrying the polished accent of expensive education. Margaret watched this interaction with fascination. It was a perfect example of what sociologists called social capital, the invisible currency that opened doors and created opportunities. These people moved through the world expecting to be helped, expecting to be taken seriously, expecting to belong. And because they expected it, they usually received it. She thought about her own daughter, Lisa, who was studying business at the community college. Lisa had inherited Margaret's musical ear, but had chosen a more practical path, watching. Her mother struggled financially for too many years to risk following artistic dreams. Just last week, Lisa had asked why Margaret was putting herself through this audition. "Mom, you know you're talented," Lisa had said, sitting at their small kitchen table over cups of instant coffee. "But these competitions are for people with connections, people who went to fancy schools. Why put yourself through the stress?" Margaret had struggled to explain it then, and she was still struggling with it now. It wasn't about winning or proving anything to these other contestants. It was about proving something to herself, that 15 years of playing in empty hospital corridors hadn't been wasted, that the music that had sustained her through divorce and financial struggles and the quiet loneliness of middle age actually meant something. A commotion near the practice rooms drew her attention. One of the younger contestants, barely out of his teens, was having what appeared to be a panic attack. His breathing was rapid and shallow, his hands shaking as he tried to organize his sheet music. An older woman, probably his teacher or mentor, was speaking to him in soothing tones. "Remember what we practiced," she said gently. "The music is already inside you. The performance is just letting it out." Margaret felt a pang of sympathy for the young man. She recognized the terror in his eyes the way fear could paralyze even the most prepared musician. She had felt that same fear countless times, though never in a setting quite like this. Her fears had been smaller, more private. The fear of playing for a patient who might not appreciate it. The fear of her colleagues discovering her musical hobby and thinking she was putting on airs. But watching this young man struggle, Margaret realized something important. Fear was the great equalizer. Underneath all the designer clothes and expensive educations, underneath the confident conversations and name-dropping, everyone in this room was afraid. They were afraid of making mistakes, afraid of not being good enough, afraid of being judged and found wanting. The difference was that some people had learned to hide their fear better than others. The Emerald Dress Group was probably just as nervous as the panicking teenager, but they had been taught to mask it with social grace and casual confidence. Margaret, on the other hand, had learned to acknowledge her fear and work with it, rather than against it. She remembered a particularly difficult night at the hospital, when they had lost a patient despite everyone's best efforts. The family was devastated, the medical staff was emotionally drained, and the entire ward felt heavy with grief. Margaret had finished her cleaning duties and found herself at the old piano in the family waiting area. Without thinking, she had started playing a gentle hymn, something soft and comforting. One by one, people had stopped what they were doing to listen. Doctors paused in the hallway, nurses sat down in nearby chairs, and family members found a moment of peace in the middle of their worst day. That night, Margaret had understood something profound about music. It wasn't about perfection or technical skill. It was about connection, about finding the shared human experience that exists underneath all our differences. Looking around the lobby now, Margaret saw beyond the designer clothes and confident postures. She saw the same hopes and fears that existed in everyone who had ever sat down at a piano with something to say. The only difference was that some people had been given more opportunities to say it publicly. The afternoon light was beginning to slant through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the marble floor. Soon, they would all be called to perform, to lay their hearts bare in front of judges who would decide their fates in a matter of minutes. Margaret closed her eyes and let herself feel the familiar calm that came before she played. In a few hours, none of these social differences would matter. There would only be the music and the story each person chose to tell through it. The afternoon had stretched on like a slow-moving river, with contestants disappearing into the auditorium one by one, only to emerge 20 minutes later looking either elated or devastated. Margaret had watched this parade of emotions from her corner seat, noting how some people walked out with confident smiles while others hurried past with tears in their eyes. She had counted 17 performers so far. The young man in the expensive suit had gone in looking like he owned the world and came out looking like someone had stolen his lunch money. One of the women in designer gowns had practically floated out of the auditorium, her face glowing with satisfaction. Another had rushed straight to the bathroom, her hand covering her mouth. Margaret tried not to think about what was happening behind those heavy oak doors. She knew the setup from her cleaning work, a massive stage with a concert grand piano, positioned perfectly under warm spotlights. 3 judges sitting at a table in the otherwise empty auditorium, their faces unreadable as they made notes that would determine someone's future in a matter of minutes. Her palms were starting to sweat, and she wiped them discreetly on her cardigan. The same cardigan she had worn to countless parent-teacher conferences, job interviews, and hospital shifts. It was like armor now, familiar and comforting in a world that felt increasingly foreign. "Margaret Chun," a voice called from the auditorium. Entrance. The waiting area, which had been buzzing with nervous energy, suddenly fell silent. Every head turned toward Margaret as she stood up, her legs feeling unsteady for just a moment. She could feel the weight of their stares, hear the whispered comments that people made no effort to hide. "That's her," someone said, not bothering to lower their voice. "I can't believe she's actually going through with this," another added. "This should be interesting," came a third voice, dripping with the kind of false sympathy that was worse than outright mockery. Margaret walked toward the auditorium entrance, her sensible shoes making soft sounds on the marble floor. Each step felt like it took forever, yet somehow she arrived at the door too quickly. The young assistant who had mistaken her for cleaning staff earlier was holding the door open, her expression a mixture of curiosity and barely concealed amusement. "Good luck," she said, though her tone suggested she didn't expect Margaret would need luck so much as a miracle. The auditorium was even more intimidating than Margaret remembered from her cleaning days. During those late-night shifts, the space had felt intimate and welcoming, with soft work lights creating cozy pools of illumination. Now, with the full stage lighting blazing and the rest of the hall draped in shadows, it felt like walking into a cathedral designed for judgment rather than worship. The piano sat center stage like a sleeping giant, its black surface reflecting the lights like still water. Margaret had cleaned that piano countless times, polishing its surface until it gleamed, carefully dusting around the keys, even occasionally lifting the lid to clean the strings inside. She knew every curve of its elegant lines, every small scratch in its otherwise perfect finish. The 3 judges sat at their table in the front row, their faces partially hidden in shadow. Dr. Vincent Harrison was in the center, his silver hair catching the light as he made notes on a tablet. To his left sat Professor Chun, no relation, despite sharing Margaret's last name, a stern woman known for her exacting standards. On the right was Dr. Rodriguez, younger than the other 2, but equally respected in classical music circles. None of them looked up as Margaret walked across the stage. They were shuffling papers, comparing notes from the previous contestant, existing in their own world of professional assessment. To them, she was just another name on a list. Another 20 minutes in a long day of auditions. Margaret reached the piano bench and paused. The silence in the auditorium was complete, the kind of heavy quiet that seems to press against your eardrums. She could hear her own heartbeat, the soft rustle of her clothes as she breathed, even the faint hum of the air conditioning system. She sat down and adjusted the bench height, her movements careful and deliberate. The keys were exactly as she remembered them, smooth ivory and ebony that had been played by countless musicians over the years. Some of the greatest pianists in the world had sat in this exact spot, their fingers dancing across these same keys. "What will you be performing today?" Dr. Harrison asked, his voice carrying clearly across the empty auditorium. He still hadn't looked up from his notes, his tone suggesting this was merely a formality before the real business of evaluation began. Margaret cleared her throat softly. "Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor, Opus 23. Now all three judges looked up. Dr. Harrison's eyebrows rose slightly. Professor Chun tilted her head with interest, and Dr. Rodriguez actually set down his pen. The Ballade No. 1 was not a piece that amateur pianists typically attempted. It was a work that demanded not just technical skill, but deep musical understanding, the kind of piece that separated serious musicians from talented hobbyists. From somewhere in the wings, Margaret heard a barely suppressed snicker. She couldn't see who it was, but she could imagine the expressions on the faces of the remaining contestants. They probably thought she was delusional, choosing one of the most challenging pieces in the romantic repertoire when she clearly didn't belong in their world. Margaret placed her hands above the keys and closed her eyes for just a moment. In that instant, the auditorium faded away. The judges disappeared. The whispers from the wings fell silent. Even her own nervousness seemed to dissolve. She was back in the hospital corridor at 2 in the morning, playing for an audience of empty chairs and sleeping patients, letting the music flow from her heart through her fingers without any thought of judgment or comparison. She thought about the first time she had heard this piece, late one night on the classical radio station that kept her company during her loneliest hours. The melody had seemed to capture everything she was feeling but couldn't express, the sadness of dreams deferred, the quiet strength that keeps you going when life feels overwhelming, the beauty that can emerge from the most unlikely circumstances. Over the years, she had made this piece her own, not through formal study or professional coaching, but through thousands of hours of patient practice, playing it over and over until she understood not just the notes, but the story they told. She had played it during her divorce when she needed strength, during her mother's illness when she needed comfort, during the long nights when she questioned whether her life had any meaning beyond paying bills and getting through each day. Auditorium seemed to hold its breath as Margaret's fingers found their position. The opening of the ballade was deceptively simple, a gentle, almost questioning melody that could easily be mistaken for child's play. But Margaret knew, as any serious student of Chopin knew, that this simplicity was an illusion. The entire emotional journey of the piece was contained in those first few measures. Like a seed that would grow into something magnificent and complex, she could feel the weight of expectation in the room, the assumption that she would stumble through a few bars before the judges mercifully stopped her performance. She could sense the mixture of curiosity and condescension from the wings, where the other contestants waited to see their suspicions confirmed. But as Margaret prepared to play the first note, something strange happened. All of that external noise, the judgments, the expectations, the whispered comments, simply fell away. She was no longer a middle-aged janitor who had wandered into the wrong place. She was no longer the odd woman out in a room full of polished professionals. She was simply a musician, sitting at a beautiful instrument, preparing to share something that had sustained her through the most difficult years of her life. Her fingers hovered over the keys, and in that moment of perfect stillness before the music began, Margaret felt more at home than she had all day. The auditorium waited, suspended in that breathless moment before sound becomes music, before notes become meaning, before a life lived quietly in the shadows steps into the light. The first note that emerged from the piano was like a question whispered in the dark, soft, tentative, but carrying within it the promise of something profound. Margaret's right hand found the opening melody of Chopin's Ballade with the certainty of someone returning home after a long journey. The sound that filled the auditorium was nothing like what anyone had expected to hear. Dr. Harrison's pen stopped moving across his notepad. The scratching sound that had been a constant background noise throughout the day's auditions suddenly ceased, leaving only the pure voice of the piano floating through the vast space. Professor Chun, who had been reaching for her water bottle, froze mid-motion, her hand suspended in the air as if time itself had paused in the wings. The remaining contestants had been whispering among themselves, probably placing bets on how quickly this embarrassing performance would end. But as Margaret's fingers moved through the opening phrases, the whispers died away one by one, replaced by a silence that was different from the polite quiet they had maintained for other performers. This was the silence of recognition, of people. Suddenly realizing they were witnessing something unexpected, Margaret herself felt the familiar transformation that happened whenever she truly connected with a piece of music. The nervous woman in the worn cardigan seemed to dissolve, replaced by someone who had lived with this music for so long that it had become part of her DNA. Her posture straightened, not with artificial confidence, but with the natural poise that comes from doing something you were born to do. The opening section of the ballade unfolded like a conversation between old friends. Each phrase emerged with perfect timing, not rushed despite nerves, not dragged despite the temptation to savor every moment. Margaret had learned this pacing during countless late nights at the hospital, playing for an audience of empty hallways and sleeping patients who needed music that healed rather than impressed. Dr. Rodriguez, the youngest of the three judges, actually leaned forward in his chair. He had heard dozens of performances of this piece over the years, from conservatory students who could execute every technical passage flawlessly, but somehow missed the emotional core of the music. What he was hearing now was different, technically. Precise, yes, but more importantly, it was deeply felt. As Margaret moved into the more complex middle sections, her hands seemed to know exactly where each note lived on the keyboard. There was no hesitation, no searching for the right keys. These weren't just memorized patterns of finger movements. This was music that flowed from somewhere much deeper than muscle memory. The audience in the wings began to shift and move closer, to get a better view. The young man in the expensive suit, who had emerged from his own audition looking defeated, now stood transfixed by what he was hearing. The woman in the emerald dress, who had been so dismissive earlier, found herself holding her breath as Margaret navigated a particularly challenging passage that had given her trouble. In her own performance just hours before, Margaret's interpretation brought out colors in the music that many listeners had never noticed before. Where other performers might race through the technical passages to show off their speed, Margaret allowed each note to speak, creating textures and layers that told a story rather than simply displaying skill. It was like the difference between reading words quickly and actually understanding the meaning behind them. The hospital years had taught her something that conservatory training sometimes missed. Music was meant to serve people, not the other way around. Every night when she played in those quiet corridors, she was reminded that the purpose of music wasn't to impress critics or win competitions. It was to touch something universal in the human experience, to provide comfort during dark times, to celebrate moments of joy, to give voice to emotions that words couldn't express. This understanding infused every phrase of her performance. When the music turned melancholy, it carried the weight of genuine sadness, not the theatrical sadness of someone trying to seem deep, but the quiet sorrow of someone who had cleaned hospital rooms where family said goodbye to loved ones. When the music soared with hope, it reflected the real joy of watching patients recover, of seeing new life enter the world during her shifts in the maternity ward. Professor Chun, known throughout the classical music world for her poker face, during auditions found herself blinking back tears. She had spent decades listening to technically perfect performances that left her cold, performances where every note was in place, but the music itself seemed to have no soul. What she was hearing now reminded her why she had fallen in love with music in the first place, back when she was a young student who played not for grades or recognition, but simply because the music demanded to be played. The transformation wasn't just happening on stage. Throughout the auditorium, people were being reminded of their own relationship with music, their own reasons for choosing this difficult and often thankless path. The cleaning lady at the piano was teaching them something they had forgotten. In their pursuit of professional success, that music at its highest level wasn't about competing with others. It was about connecting with something larger than yourself. Margaret moved through the dramatic climax of the piece with a power that seemed to come from somewhere beyond her small frame. Her hands moved across the keyboard with increasing intensity, but never lost their musical sensitivity. Even in the loudest, most technically demanding passages, every note served the greater musical purpose. There was no showing off, no unnecessary drama, just pure musical storytelling at its finest. The young assistant who had mistaken Margaret for cleaning staff was now standing in the auditorium doorway, her clipboard forgotten in her hands. She had heard hundreds of auditions over her years working at the concert hall, but she had never heard anything quite like this. The music seemed to fill not just the physical space of the auditorium, but something deeper, the emotional space that exists between performer and listener, the place where true communication happens. As Margaret approached the final section of the ballade, the entire auditorium seemed to lean forward collectively. This was the moment that separated good pianists from great ones, where technical skill had to combine with emotional depth to bring the piece to its inevitable conclusion. Margaret's fingers found every note with the precision of a master craftsman. But more importantly, her musical soul guided every phrase toward its destined resolution. The hospital corridors where she had spent so many nights practicing seemed very far away now, yet they were also completely present in every note she played. Those quiet hours had not been wasted time or secret indulgence. They had been preparation for this moment, though she had never dared to imagine it would come. Dr. Harrison sat completely still, his experienced ear recognizing something rare and precious. In 40 years of teaching and judging competitions, he had encountered perhaps a handful of performers who possessed this quality, the ability to make music that transcended technique and touched something essential in the human spirit. He had almost given up hoping to hear it again, especially in a competition setting, where most performers were more concerned with avoiding mistakes than with making music. The auditorium held its breath as Margaret played the final phrases, each note landing with the inevitability of truth, each silence between notes carrying as much meaning as the sounds themselves. This wasn't just a piano audition anymore. It was a reminder of why music mattered, why people devoted their lives to an art form that couldn't be easily quantified or explained, but somehow made life more worth living. The final note of the ballade hung in the air like a prayer answered, its resonance seeming to touch every corner of the vast auditorium before slowly fading into silence. Margaret's hands remained poised above the keyboard for a moment, her eyes still closed, as if she was reluctant to let go of the connection she had just shared with the music. The silence that followed was unlike anything the auditorium had experienced that day. It wasn't the polite pause that typically followed auditions, nor was it the awkward quiet that sometimes filled the space after a poor performance. This was the profound silence that comes after witnessing something transformative, the kind of moment that makes people hold their breath because they instinctively know they have just experienced something rare. Dr. Harrison was the first to move. His hands came together in slow, deliberate applause, the sound echoing through the empty hall like gunshots. But there was nothing perfunctory about his clapping. Each strike of his palms carried genuine emotion, the kind of response that comes from a lifetime of musical experience recognizing something extraordinary. Professor Chin joined him, her usual stern composure completely abandoned as tears streamed down her cheeks. She had spent decades building walls around her emotions during auditions, training herself to evaluate performances with clinical detachment. But Margaret's playing had torn through those defenses as easily as sunlight breaking through clouds. reminding her of the young girl who had once sat at her grandmother's piano and played simply because the music made her feel alive. Dr. Rodriguez was on his feet now, his applause building in intensity. As the youngest of the three judges, he had often wondered if he was becoming too jaded, too caught up in the technical aspects of performance to appreciate the heart of music. Margaret's performance had answered that question emphatically. His soul was very much alive, just waiting for the right music to awaken it. Margaret slowly opened her eyes and turned toward the judges' table. The sight that greeted her was beyond anything she could have imagined. Three of the most respected figures in classical music were standing, applauding not just politely but with genuine enthusiasm. Dr. Harrison's face wore an expression she had never seen in any of the online masterclasses she had watched: pure joy mixed with professional amazement. From the wings came the sound of more applause. The remaining contestants, who had started the day viewing Margaret as an amusing distraction from the serious business of competition, were now clapping with the fervor of people who had just witnessed history. The young man in the expensive suit was shaking his head in disbelief, not with condescension but with the humility that comes from recognizing superior artistry. The woman in the emerald dress, who had been so quick to dismiss Margaret hours earlier, was applauding with tears in her own eyes. The performance had reminded her why she had started playing piano in the first place, back when she was 7 years old and music was about wonder rather than winning. She realized with sudden clarity that somewhere along the way, in her pursuit of technical perfection and professional success, she had lost touch with the very thing that made music magical. Margaret rose from the piano bench, her legs feeling unsteady, not from nerves now, but from the emotional intensity of what had just happened. She had poured 15 years of quiet practice, of stolen moments between hospital duties, of dreams deferred but never abandoned, into those 20 minutes at the piano. The response was more than she had ever dared to hope for. "Where did you study?" Dr. Harrison asked, his voice carrying across the auditorium with genuine curiosity. The question wasn't asked with the dismissive tone she had grown accustomed to, but with the respect accorded to a serious artist. Margaret walked to the front of the stage, closer to the judges' table. Her voice, when she spoke, was steady despite the magnitude of the moment. "I didn't study anywhere formal," she said simply. "I taught myself. I work nights at the hospital. I'm a janitor there, and I've been playing piano in the corridors during my breaks for the past 15 years. The revelation sent a visible wave of shock through the auditorium. Dr. Rodriguez actually sat down heavily, as if the information was too much to process while standing. Professor Chun covered her mouth with her hand, her eyes wide with amazement. They had all assumed they were listening to someone with extensive formal training, perhaps a late bloomer who had studied privately with a master teacher. The idea that this level of musical sophistication had developed in hospital corridors, during stolen moments between emptying trash cans and mopping floors, challenged everything they thought they knew about musical education and development. It was like discovering that someone had learned to paint masterpieces by watching sunsets, or had become a poet by reading medicine bottles. "You mean to tell me," Dr. Harrison said slowly, "that you developed this level of interpretation and technique entirely on your own?" Margaret nodded, feeling heat rise in her cheeks. "I watched videos online when I could afford internet. I borrowed books from the library. But mostly I just played. The patients seem to like it when I play softly in the corridors. It helps them sleep." This last detail hit the judges like a physical blow. The image of this woman playing Chopin's most challenging pieces, not for audiences or critics, but for sick people who needed comfort, transformed their understanding of what they had just witnessed. This wasn't just exceptional musicianship. It was music in service of its highest purpose, healing and bringing peace to those who needed it most. In the wings, conversations were happening in whispers that carried the weight of revelation. The other contestants were sharing the same realization. They had been so focused on competing with each other that they had forgotten music was supposed to be about something larger than personal achievement. Margaret's performance had reminded them that the greatest artists throughout history had always been those who used their gifts to serve others, not just themselves. 3 weeks later, Margaret was standing in her small apartment, holding a phone with trembling hands. The voice on the other end belonged to Dr. Harrison, and the words he was speaking seemed impossible to believe. The decision was unanimous, he was saying. We've never seen a response quite like this. The board of directors wants to meet with you next week to discuss the details. Margaret had won the competition. Not only that, but the story of the hospital janitor who had taught herself to play piano had spread throughout the classical music community like wildfire. Suddenly, everyone wanted to know about the woman who had reminded them all why music mattered. The debut performance with the Philharmonic was scheduled for 6 weeks later. When the night arrived, Margaret stood in the wings of the same auditorium, where her life had changed, wearing a simple but elegant black dress that her daughter Lisa had helped her choose. The auditorium was sold out, filled not just with classical music enthusiasts but with hospital workers, patients' families, and people who had never attended a classical concert before, but had been drawn by Margaret's story. As she walked onto the stage that night, the audience rose to their feet before she had even reached the piano. They weren't just applauding a performance that hadn't yet begun. They were celebrating something more fundamental. They were celebrating the triumph of passion over privilege, of authenticity over artifice, of music that came from the heart rather than from a curriculum. Margaret sat at the same piano, where her life had changed 6 weeks earlier. As she placed her hands on the keys to begin her performance of the same Chopin ballade that had started it all, she thought about all the nights she had played in empty hospital corridors, never imagining that anyone important was listening. She had been wrong about that. The most important audience had been listening all along, not critics or judges or fellow musicians, but people who needed music to make their lives more bearable, more beautiful, more human. Tonight, she would play for an auditorium full of people, but in her heart, she was still playing for those patients who had found comfort in her music during their darkest hours. The first note emerged from the piano, with the same gentle certainty that had changed everything weeks before, and Margaret smiled as she felt the familiar transformation begin once again. Some stories, she realized, are just beginning when they seem to end.